Welcome back to Munro Live, everybody. Today we have Jordan Arocha and myself, Cory. We are going to review the Audi Q4 Prestige Sportback. I don't know if I got that right.
I think it might be Sportback Prestige. It's one of the longer vehicle names.
Yeah, and we were provided this E-Tron as a press vehicle from Audi, so thank you very much. We're going to do the hoist review. So we spent about 5 or 10 minutes underneath trying to find some stuff, and now we'll run through what we found. So the first thing that stuck out at us that I don't remember from the VW ID.4, which is a very similar shared platform to this, was this on the knuckle. So if you can see right here, you have a linkage from your steering rack coming out, but there's a machined surface and a machined tapped hole there, as well as a face up there, machined surface with a tapped hole. I don't know what this is for. That's a lot of cost to have not only this extra material, but this machining operation. I was thinking maybe it's an optional EPB, having a front-mounted EPB. I only recently have seen front-mounted EPB when we were at CES and we were at the booth where they had four-wheel brakes, four-wheel steering, and also four-wheel EPB. Jordan, what's your thoughts on that? I don't know what this is for, but it's something that stuck out.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be hard-pressed to say it was for any other reason than an EPB provision. It is very odd. It's a lot of additional cost because it's not just extra material. They've got a lot of secondary processing there. They've got 2 drilled and tapped holes and machined flats on the surfaces, right? So we're talking about this area specifically right here, as well as one a little bit higher up on the knuckle. But yeah, presumably they've got a variant, perhaps in a other region, that does get an EPB on the front knuckle. Yeah.
And let's talk a little bit about the front structure. So we have a stamped steel cradle with also a couple aluminum crosscar pieces. You have stamped steel lower control arms with aluminum knuckles, a traditional McPherson strut design, stabilizer bar, and a dual piston sliding caliper. This is about as standard as you can get from a architecture for a vehicle in the 21st century. Jordan, do you have any thoughts on their approach to Sorb, any crush cans? What do you see?
Yeah, it's going to be hard to see from this view, but if you were to look upward in vehicle, the primary load beams, they have a crush can, and I haven't actually been able to get a measurement on it, but qualitatively looking at it, it looks to be one of the longer crush cans fore aft in vehicle that we typically see. And so whether that's to manage like the vehicle pulse index, aka VPI, or it's just part of their impact script given the number of hard points that they have in the motor bay, just the length of that crush can rail is kind of interesting. However, and this is also something that we would need to measure to confirm, it doesn't necessarily appear that that crush can is within that 25% barrier zone. In fact, it may be a little bit inboard. And so what I'm seeing in the lower structure, being the subframe, is that the subframe does seem to jut outboard in the vehicle a little bit further. And so I think what they're doing from a Sorb perspective predominantly is engaging the subframe and then likely the shotgun, which runs just adjacent to the outboard side of the strut. That's part of the body structure. I think they're using the cradle and the shotgun predominantly to manage most of that load driven by Sorb.
Yeah. And as we look further into some packaging decisions, you know, when VW came out with the ID.4, we opened the hood and there's no frunk. So they have ample room to route all the lines for their refrigerant system. This has a heat pump as well as the ethylene glycol for thermal management of your high voltage components, your motors, and your battery. And we can see some decisions that were made here. So Jordan and I noticed that they're routing to the condenser across the bottom of the vehicle to this point over here. And then it's going to go through out and pick up the condenser, which is out front. You have a standard condenser, which is what you'd have on a normal internal combustion engine vehicle. But this compressor is a high voltage AC compressor, which is going to compress that refrigerant. This vehicle uses CO2. It does not use R1234YF. And then the heat pump system has a lot of valving up along the right rail. We kind of covered that in a different video, but really a complex array of blocks, valves, routing, and hoses. But they do a pretty good job of keeping some of the lines out of the impact path. This is something Jordan and I cover a lot of times when we look at vehicles. Think about driving down the road and running over a cinder block. If that cinder block came, it's going to hit this, which is going to protect it. So this is a big stamped steel cross member portion. Then all of the components are really high up. And Eric, if you can get in here, a lot of the thermal system routing is out of that impact path. And then there's this leading edge right here, this extrusion that protects the dual layer thermal path. And Jordan, you can talk a little bit more about their strategy for cooling in the battery. But one thing we don't like to see is a high utilization of EPDM and constant tension spring clamps. So you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 or 6 constant tension spring clamps. Then they're using these wire bands in some places, and other lines they're using looks like PA12 on this. No, EPDM line right here. So there's not one strategy for thermal system lines, which isn't necessarily a good thing or a bad thing, but it's nice when we look at other vehicles and they're using one material, one connector style, one interface for nearly all their ports. That's not the case here. It may be utilization of multiple suppliers. Jordan, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it could be a number of things to include design for assembly, right? So if depending on what their bill of process, meaning the manner in which all these different subsystems come together, they may want hoses that are truly ductile and have more flexibility so that they can make connection from A to B easier in terms of the operator. But that being said, my comment to VW or Audi in this case would be, I would work on the bill of process to eliminate more of those operator manipulations so as to omit the potentially necessary EPDM lines that they have here and go to something more like this, this HDPE and EPDM line here, which is going to be lighter. They've got quick connects that gives you positive assurance once you place it. There's a lot of benefits to going to something like this, but you need to think about that when the vehicle's being designed and not too late in the game.
Yeah, and you may be watching this video thinking, why does this matter? So Jordan and Cory standing in their car pointing at the complexity of these thermal lines. Every bend in a wire, every bend in a tube adds resistance. Every additional part adds weight. So if you add that up, it's like death by 1,000 cuts when you're sizing the pumps to push this fluid through. Now the pump might have to be larger. If you have twice as much fluid in the system, if you're trying to heat that fluid in the front of the vehicle and get it to the back of the vehicle or in the middle, the more fluid you have to heat, the more energy you need to use. So it affects you when you get in the vehicle and you're driving and your winter range is suffering. It's these decisions, these tiny decisions, added brackets, added connectors. Now, you could continue to refine an automobile design essentially in perpetuity. So at what point do you stop? And we see different levels of refinement in different systems on all OEMs. It's really what makes our job enjoyable, is because Jordan and I, we see dozens of cars roll in this place and we learn something every day. We're befuddled by some stuff and impressed by others. There's something that really impresses me about the German OEMs. Their fastening strategy typically uses really lightweight, efficient fasteners. If you look at these triple squares here, you may think it may not make a big difference, but the fact that there's material missing from the heads of these bolts reduces the weight. And you will see that in the knuckles. So over in the knuckles, they use these very efficient triple square head fasteners. And there's 3 or 4 of them. I think there's 4. That matters, that reduction in weight. Other OEMs will use a traditional fastener, but it's these tiny, tiny reductions that really add up. And if you look at automobiles and auto racing, they'll be using titanium bolts. So there's a certain cost versus benefit trade-off. And this whole thing could be made of aluminum and magnesium, titanium, and carbon fiber, but then you couldn't afford it. So we're always trying to find these tiny little elements to help other OEMs get better. And sorry for the philosophical rant, but it's just, this is enjoyable to me, standing under here, going through all these minute differences. So Jordan, what are we going to do now? We're going to look at the battery. We're going to move our way back.
Yeah, there was one more thing I wanted to cover in the front, and then yeah, we'll dive right into the battery pack. So, and it's kind of harkening back to when we did some studies looking at the VW MQB platform. So that's like the Golf and the A3 and I think the A4 at the time, and they used a true rack and pinion steering system. Now, Eric, if you were to swing around from the backside here. Right here, this is the input coming from the steering column, going into the steering rack, which is controlling lateral movement left, right of the wheel. So when you turn the wheel, that drives an input here, which drives a rack, which is essentially a bar with a bunch of notches cut in it. And most people that use a electric power steering unit or a rack mounted will do a belt driven unit. This is a true rack and pinion, so much like a gearbox or an input to a differential, it's got gear-on-gear contact, and so that could offer a couple of things. It could be more durability. It also could be more direct feedback, right? As you can imagine, a belt is going to stretch a little bit minutely every time it receives an input. So it's interesting, but hearkening back to what Cory was talking about in terms of ground clearance, we've often seen the steering racks themselves have dedicated shields under them so as to protect them from different forms of impingement. VW took this and just set it right on top of the cradle. So no additional structure. The structure probably needs to be here anyways, and they protect the rack in tandem.
Yeah, nice.
Maybe moving back to the battery pack, and Cory, you started to highlight the thermal management plate here. So right here, you can see these two sort of bulbous sections sticking down from the underside of the pack. What that is two separate plates, stamped aluminum plates that are brazed together, and they are formed in such a way that when the coolant comes in and therefore out, if you were to take this lid or this cover off of the battery pack, you would see all sorts of channels and sort of a serpentine pattern under here, which is providing coolant and heat rejection or absorbing the heat rejection coming from the batteries above them. The reason that we like that, when Cory was talking about all the different connectors, all the different bends and all of those things, this brazed plate with two pieces, they're doing what in a conventional pack where you've got jumpers and lines and hoses, you could be omitting maybe 100 parts. And every one of those parts no longer needs to be grabbed. And so kudos to VW, both on this Audi E-Tron as well as the ID.4 for doing that.
And here's a couple real fine details. Notice these holes that are stamped into this lower cover. These are for access to the fasteners through. There's also a little feature stamped into the back side of each, probably for two things, for NVH and aero. I'm assuming if it was just a normal hole, you could get some whistling. Not only whistling, but you could also get some stuff flying up there. But each one of these has a little recess stamped into the back of them. I didn't notice that on the VW ID.4. I know we have an ID.4. I want to check out if this feature was on there.
Yeah, likewise. Yeah, it's interesting. If it's bad for aero, it's almost always bad from an NVH perspective.
NVH?
Noise, vibration, and harshness. Yeah.
We need to remember to do all of our acronyms for our people.
That's right. That's right.
Now this rear unit looks like identical to the rear unit we tore down on the channel probably about a year and a half ago. So thanks to VW for providing us with a rear drive motor. I was pretty impressed with what's going on inside of there. It's a nice unit. The rear suspension, so you have this is what I call a standard rear cradle. So it's a formed tubular weldment. So there are some stampings in the rear, but the front portion and the side portions, they look like hydroformed tubes. Jordan, would you say they're hydroformed?
Yeah, I would agree.
And the rear cradle is isolated. What we mean by isolated is you have rubber bushings here on each of the 4 locations. So there's a mounting location here, a mounting location there, and then mirrored on the other side. The links, basic stamped steel, except for this one right here. Typically, this is the most challenging link for a rear suspension because as the suspension travels up, it has to clear the rail. So it's bent at an angle so as it goes up, and this one over here as well. They both look to be forged aluminum. So yep, I see aluminum right on the side. Jordan, do you have anything to say about this suspension geometry?
No, relatively conventional multi-link, right? For their primary tension and compression links, or camber and toe links, however you want to refer to them as. They did go forged aluminum. One thing I did like was on the stabilizer bar, they used a single injection molded piece for their stabilizer bar link, right? And you'll notice one of the benefits in the way that they mounted it to the upper control arm is most stabilizer bar links have 2 ball joints. So inside of this socket here, there's a ball that can articulate as the stabilizer bar goes through its motions. But if you look at the top, it's simply a bolt going to the control arm. And so they were able to design the geometry in such a way that as the suspension goes through jounce and rebound or up and down, they didn't need the articulation at the top joint. So they omitted 2 ball joints at a minimum per rear suspension. So nice job there. The other thing, you know, Cory, you were talking about the hydroforming. People may just be thinking about what hydroforming, does that mean it's formed in water? Well, sort of. The answer is the water, actually what it does, if you can imagine this, it goes inside a straight tube that has no other geometry other than a hollow cylinder. And the water pressurizes it, they close the cavity off, and they close the tool over it. And what the water does is it pushes against the inside wall of this so that when the tool closes, you don't get weird kinks or wrinkles or anything in the material, which allows them to get, I'll say, more organic geometry. But it's not that the water forms the tube. The water provides the internal resistance so that the tube doesn't wrinkle or do something, I'll say, undesirable in terms of the final output. So just to kind of articulate a little bit what that is.
Yeah, looking at some minute details here, I like to see reuse of parts. So there's this little piece right here that's acting not only as the washer for this nut, they've also stamped a little locating feature for this line right here, as well as this double shear plate. There's the mounting provision for an aero shield. I like to see reuse versus having an additional piece or part. Same thing here. There's a mounting bracket for the wheel speed sensor. It's integrated into the plate that acts as the washer for 2 of the bolts for the brake caliper. Yeah, these are brake bolts right there. It's not a caliper, it's a drum. Sorry, I didn't want to misspeak there. And then for an Audi, a $60,000 Audi, this thing has drum brakes on the rear. I mean, from an aesthetic perspective, you come look on the outside. Woof. The best thing they did was they kind of made it look like a brake rotor. See, it has kind of a brake rotor look.
Yeah, they really made an effort to sort of flatten out the wall, right? So it has that rotor look. And then like a lot of old school drums, like if you were to look at some old trucks or something, you would see a bunch of like rib features on the outboard side. So they omitted all of those from the design.
Yeah. It's like a faux rotor.
It's like a faux rotor. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so I guess if you're going to fake it, make it look like a rotor.
Yeah.
And one thing, Jordan, I noticed was you have a traditional recovery hook. You want to call it a tow hook. If you fly into a ditch, you can hook onto here, but you still have the access panel to the screw-in recovery hook. So if you're in a real bind and you're at a bad angle, you don't want the tow truck having the strap pulling up on your rear fascia. It's much better to screw in the recovery hook through that access point to pull.
Yeah, overall, it's an interesting design. You know, the drum brake thing is always, it's interesting. I'd love to talk to VW about what drove them to that decision. It makes sense depending on what perspective you're looking at: weight, durability, longevity, fill in the blank. But it is interesting. But yeah, all in all, interesting vehicle. What do you think, Cory?
It's about as basic and standard as you can get from an automobile, in my opinion.
Yeah.
So, but why does that matter? Maybe it doesn't. So when you're deciding whether you want to buy this vehicle, maybe a Ford Mustang Mach-E, a Tesla, what drives you to that decision? It's probably not how the underpinnings of the vehicle are assembled. It's what drives our company to help OEMs improve. And it's really what we do all day long. We have half a dozen vehicles in here, all tore down, probably 25 or 30 battery packs. Yep. It's really what drives our organization. So hopefully we brought you some value in our assessment of the Audi Q4 E-Tron Sportback
Pros.
Prestige.
Nice job.
Yeah. So thanks again for watching Munro Live. We really appreciate it. If you aren't already subscribed, please do. A lot more content like this.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.